Some say the deadliest gun in the West is the one you never see coming. Others claim it's the one with nothing left to lose. But the most dangerous adversary of all, that's the hunted who knows the land better than the hunters and decides it's time to turn the tables. In the untamed wilderness of Shadowpine Forest, a band of outlaws is about to discover that sometimes the prey you chase has sharper teeth than your own. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn painted the rugged peaks of the Crimson Mountains with hues of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the weathered timber of the Blackwood Ranch. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney as Sarah Blackwood moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. At 45, she had the lean, muscular build of someone who'd worked the land her entire life, with observant hazel eyes that missed nothing and calloused hands that told stories of self-reliance. Her sun-bronzed face carried dignified lines of both hardship and laughter, framed by dark hair streaked with silver that she kept tied back in a practical braid. 3 years had passed since she'd received the folded flag and her husband's silver marshal's badge. Thomas Blackwood, former U.S. Marshal turned rancher, had died defending a stagecoach from the notorious Rattlesnake Gang, leaving Sarah alone with their 18-year-old son, Ethan, to manage the sprawling ranch his grandfather had established. Since then, she'd retreated further into the wilderness, coming to town only when absolutely necessary for supplies, preferring the company of the ancient pines and rugged terrain to the pitying glances of townsfolk. Another day in paradise, she murmured to herself, stepping onto the porch and breathing in the crisp mountain air. The forest surrounding the ranch was alive with morning sounds, birds calling, the distant bugle of an elk, the rustling of the pine trees in the gentle breeze. This was her home now, her sanctuary, the place where she felt closest to Thomas and the legacy they had built together. Inside the cabin, Ethan Blackwood sat at the rough-hewn dining table, his lanky frame hunched over a worn leather-bound journal. At 18, he was the spitting image of his father, tall and broad-shouldered, with the same piercing blue eyes and determined set to his jaw. Unlike many young men his age who'd already left for opportunities in larger settlements, Ethan remained devoted to the ranch and to his mother, though Sarah could see the restlessness of youth in his quick movements and eager eyes. "Ma," he called as she re-entered the cabin, "I've been studying Pa's old maps of the North Ridge. I think we could run twice as many cattle through there if we cleared that lower pasture." Sarah smiled at her son's enthusiasm. "Your father always had said the same thing. But that lower pasture floods every spring. Nature has its reasons." Ethan nodded reluctantly, returning to the maps. Sarah watched him with a mixture of pride and concern. He had his father's determination and sense of justice, but lacked Thomas's experience and caution. In these dangerous borderlands, those qualities could mean the difference between life and death. Meanwhile, in the rapidly growing settlement of Copper Creek, Mayor Franklin Walsh stood behind his oak desk, looking at a large map of the county spread across the surface. His pinky finger, adorned with a gaudy gold ring bearing the town seal, tapped impatiently on a circled area of forest. Across from him, Jackson Vance, a sharp-dressed land speculator with cold, calculating eyes and an Eastern accent that seemed out of place in the frontier town, studied the map with obvious interest. "This is the last parcel we need, Frank," Vance said, his voice smooth as polished leather. "Once we secure those 3,000 acres, the Southern Pacific Railroad can break ground by spring. Copper Creek will become the most important stop. Between Denver and Santa Fe, don't you think I know that?" the mayor replied, frustration evident in his tone. "But this section here," he jabbed at a small area on the map, "the Blackwood Ranch sits right in the middle. Everything else has been secured. So make them an offer," Vance suggested, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his expensive brocade vest. Everyone has a price, especially widows struggling to maintain land that's too much for them. The mayor laughed bitterly. We've tried 3 times. That woman is impossible. She refuses to even meet with our representatives. Vance's jaw tightened, the only indication of his irritation. I've invested too much to let one stubborn widow derail this project. The Blackwood property is the linchpin. It connects the mountain pass to the main line route. The railroad won't consider any other options. Thomas Blackwood left that ranch to his widow and son 3 years ago when he died defending a stagecoach. Ever since then, Sarah's been living up there like some kind of mountain hermit. Barely comes to town, except for supplies. What about the son? Vance asked. His interest piqued. Ethan, just a boy, 18 or 19 now, devoted to his mother and that land. Vance drummed his manicured fingers on the desk, considering this information. Maybe we need to be more persuasive. Now hold on, Mayor Walsh said nervously. I agreed to help secure some land claims, not— Relax, Frank, Vance interrupted with a dismissive wave. I'm talking about motivation, not intimidation. He pulled out a checkbook embossed with gold lettering. Double the offer. Everyone. Has a breaking point. Later that morning, Sarah parked her weathered wagon outside Sullivan's general store. The small town of Copper Creek had changed dramatically in the 3 years since Thomas's death. New buildings lined the main street, with saloons and gambling, houses outnumbering the essential businesses. The population sign at the town limits reading 1-200 hadn't been updated in months, and the actual number was surely much higher now. Inside, Sarah moved efficiently through the aisles, selecting ammunition, medicine, coffee, and other supplies that couldn't be produced on the ranch. At the counter, Patrick Sullivan, the store's proprietor with kind eyes and a full white beard, greeted her with a warm smile. Been a while, Sarah. How's life up on the mountain? Quiet, just the way I like it, she replied, placing her items. On the counter. Well, you might be getting some neighbors soon, Sullivan said as he tallied her purchases. The whole town's talking about this railroad business, promising jobs, prosperity, new opportunities. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened. Is that right? Yep. The mayor's been singing its praises, says it'll put us on the map. As Sullivan wrapped her purchases in brown paper, he lowered his voice. Some fella came in asking about you yesterday. Fancy Eastern suit, gold watch chain. Asked where your property was located exactly. Sarah stiffened slightly. Thanks for telling me. I played dumb, of course. Told him I didn't know much. Sullivan bagged her supplies carefully. They're holding a town meeting tonight about the railroad. Might want to attend, hear what they're planning. Sarah nodded, paid for her supplies, and headed for the door. As she exited, she noticed a sleek black carriage parked across the street, 2 men in Eastern clothes watching her from inside. She mentally noted their appearances, then continued loading her wagon as if she hadn't. Noticed? Ma, Ethan's voice called as he approached from the gunsmith's shop, a repaired rifle slung over his shoulder. Mr. Holloway says there's a band of outlaws been spotted near Eagle Pass. Says they've been robbing homesteads. Sarah frowned. Eagle Pass is just a half-day's ride from our place. That's what I said, Ethan replied, his young face serious. Maybe I should ride patrol tonight just to be safe. Sarah studied her son's eager expression. Thomas had begun teaching him tracking and shooting from the time he could walk, and the boy had his father's natural talent. But he lacked experience, and experience was what kept you alive in this unforgiving territory. We'll both ride patrol, she decided. But first, I think we should attend the town meeting tonight. The town hall was packed that evening, the scent of tobacco, leather, and unwashed bodies filling the air. Sarah and Ethan slipped quietly into the back, keeping to the shadows as Mayor Walsh stood at the podium, flanked by large illustrated posters showing gleaming railroad cars and prosperous-looking buildings. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The Southern Pacific Railroad will bring hundreds of permanent jobs to our community, Walsh proclaimed, his voice carrying through the crowded room. This is the economic opportunity Copper Creek has been waiting for. Applause rippled through the crowd. Jackson Vance stepped forward, his Eastern finery and confident demeanor drawing all eyes to him. We're not just building a railroad, friends. We're building the future of the West, Vance announced, his voice resonating with practiced charisma. Imagine your children and grandchildren being able to find prosperity right here at home, instead of having to seek their fortunes elsewhere. From her position at the back, Sarah studied the faces in the crowd. Most seemed enthusiastic, hungry for the promised prosperity, but she noticed a few, mostly older settlers, who remembered the early days of the territory, who looked skeptical. I'm proud to announce that we've secured 95% of the necessary land already, Vance continued, spreading his arms wide. Construction teams are ready to begin work within the month. The only thing standing between you and this brighter future is one small parcel of land. The room went quiet. Mayor Walsh shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar. One family who, for personal reasons, is holding up progress that would benefit everyone in this community. Heads began to turn. Someone pointed towards Sarah and Ethan. The crowd's energy shifted, curious and increasingly hostile eyes finding them in the shadows at the back of the room. Mrs. Blackwood, Vance called out, his voice carrying throughout the hall. We understand your attachment to your ranch. That's why we're prepared to offer double our previous offer. That's 4 times what the land is actually worth. Sarah remained still, her face impassive as murmurs spread through the room. Beside her, Ethan tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the pistol on his hip until Sarah placed a restraining hand on his arm. Come on, Sarah, this is good for all of us, called out a man she'd once considered a friend. We need those jobs, shouted another voice. The weight of accusatory stares became too heavy. Sarah moved toward the exit, Ethan close behind, but before they reached the door, she turned to face the crowd. That land isn't for sale, she said firmly, her voice carrying surprising authority through the room. Not at any price. The room erupted in angry murmurs as she and Ethan stepped outside into the cool night air. They walked briskly toward their wagon, but before they reached it, Vance emerged from the shadows, flanked by 2 men whose hard expressions and stance identified them as hired guns, not businessmen. Mrs. Blackwood, Vance said smoothly. Jackson, Vente, I was hoping we could speak privately. I said all I needed to say inside, Sarah replied, continuing toward the wagon. I understand your position, but perhaps you don't fully understand ours. The 2 men, Cruz and Harlow, both with the hardened eyes of men who solved problems with violence, didn't approach but established their presence, hands resting casually near their holstered revolvers. Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between the men and his mother, his young face set in a determined scowl. My mother said no. That's the end of it. Vance smiled thinly at the young man. You must be Ethan. I've heard a lot about you. Your father was a respected man. He understood. Progress, the changing times. You didn't know my father, Ethan replied coldly. That ranch holds sentimental value, I'm sure. Vance continued, ignoring Ethan and focusing on Sarah. But sentiment doesn't pay bills. We could set you up somewhere nice, comfortable. You wouldn't need to struggle with a property that's clearly too much for a woman and a boy. My husband and his father built that ranch with their own hands, Sarah said, her voice steady. It's where he wanted to be buried, and that's where he rests. Vance's voice hardened. But he's gone now, isn't he? and you're left with a burden too heavy to bear alone." Sarah's eyes flashed dangerously, but she controlled her reaction. Ethan was less disciplined, his hand moving to his pistol grip before Sarah subtly shook her head. $8,000, Mrs. Blackwood, Vance said, studying her reaction carefully. "That's my final offer. Enough to start a new life anywhere you want, to ensure your son has opportunities beyond scratching a living from those mountains." "Our life isn't for sale either," she replied. She turned and continued toward their wagon, Ethan following reluctantly, his eyes never leaving the hired guns. "You should know," Vance called after her, "the territorial governor is reviewing some outdated property lines. There might be some discrepancies that affect your claim." Sarah paused but didn't turn around. It would be a shame if legal complications forced a sale anyway, at a much lower value. Vance's voice took on a menacing edge. "Or if those Outlaws people have been talking about decided your remote ranch was an appealing target. Things get very dangerous in those mountains. Accidents happen." Sarah turned slowly, her eyes meeting Vance's with unexpected intensity. "Yes, they do." Their eyes locked in silent challenge. Vance smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sleep on it. We'll be in touch." As Sarah and Ethan drove their wagon out of town, she checked over her shoulder. A group of riders was forming behind them, following at a distance. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. This was intimidation, plain and simple. "They're following us, Ma," Ethan said quietly, his hand resting on his rifle. "I see them," Sarah replied, her voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. "When we reach Whispering Pines Junction, I want you to take the wagon and continue on the main trail. Make it obvious where you're going." Ethan frowned. "What about you?" "I'll circle back through Harper's Ravine and come up behind them. I want to see who we're dealing with, but Ma, no arguments, Ethan. Your father taught you how to handle yourself, but these men are killers. I can see it in their eyes. So am I supposed to just run?" Ethan asked, his young voice cracking with indignation. Sarah turned to look her son in the eye. "Sometimes drawing your enemy into territory you know, and they don't, is the smartest strategy. It's not running, it's choosing the battlefield." Ethan nodded reluctantly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Like Pa used to say, never fight fair when you can fight smart." "Exactly," Sarah said with a small smile. "Now, when you reach the North Ridge, don't go straight to the ranch. Lead them into Shadow Pine Forest. You know every trail and hiding place. They don't." "And then what?" Sarah's expression hardened, a glimpse of steel beneath her calm exterior. "And then we remind them why the Blackwoods have held this land for 3 generations, because we know how to defend what's ours." As the wagon rumbled toward home through the darkening wilderness, neither Sarah nor Ethan noticed the solitary rider observing them from a distant ridge. A man in a dusty black duster with a U.S. Marshal's badge gleaming dully on his chest, watching the pursuit with grim interest before turning his horse to follow at a distance. Back at their ranch, with darkness providing temporary safety, Sarah moved purposefully through the shadows. She didn't light any lamps, instead going directly to a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of the main room and retrieving a small brass key. With it, she unlocked a heavy oak chest in Thomas's old study, revealing items that spoke to another side of her life, a life before she had become simply a rancher's wife. Inside were objects that would have surprised anyone who thought they knew Sarah Blackwood. A spotless cavalry officer's uniform with lieutenant's bars, maps marked with strategic positions throughout the surrounding wilderness, letters of commendation signed by generals, and a collection of weapons that would impress even seasoned frontiersmen. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching with wide eyes, as his mother ran her fingers across a weathered cavalry scout's insignia, the same one visible on a uniform in a faded photograph on the wall, showing a younger Sarah alongside mounted troops on the frontier. "Ma?" he questioned, uncertainty. in his voice. "There's something I need to tell you about your father and me," Sarah said quietly. "Something we agreed you'd only need to know if the time came." She lifted a precisely crafted Springfield rifle from the chest, checking its action with the unpracticed hands of someone intimately familiar with the weapon. "That time has come." "You were in the cavalry?" Ethan asked, stepping closer to examine the items in the chest. "Not exactly," Sarah replied. "Your father was a U.S. Marshal, as you know, but before that, we both served as scouts for the army during the border campaigns. We were trackers, guides, the eyes and ears of troops who didn't know the territory." Understanding dawned on Ethan's face. "That's why Pa always said you were the best tracker he'd ever known." Sarah nodded. "We met during the Apache Wars. I was raised by my father at an isolated trading post, learned tracking from the native scouts who came through. Your father was a young lieutenant then, earnest and brave, but green as spring grass." A small smile touched her lips at the memory. "Together, we mapped most of this territory before it was even part of the United States." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because we wanted a different life for you, Ethan. A peaceful life." Sarah's expression grew serious, but Vance and his men aren't going to allow that. "They want our land, and they'll do whatever it takes to get it." Ethan straightened his shoulders, his jaw set with determination. "Then we'll do whatever it takes to stop them." Sarah regarded her son thoughtfully. "These men are dangerous, Ethan. More dangerous than you know. I'm not afraid." "You should be," Sarah said quietly. "Fear keeps you sharp, keeps you alive, but fear controlled is a weapon in itself." She returned to the chest and withdrew a worn, leather-bound journal. "This contains everything your father and I learned about this territory. Every trail, cave, ravine and water source within 50 miles. The men following us tonight don't know this land. To them, it's just a prize to be taken. But to us, it's home," Ethan finished. "More than that," Sarah corrected. "To us, it's hunting ground." As Sarah began sorting through the chest's contents, selecting weapons and supplies with methodical precision, Ethan watched his mother transform before his eyes. The quiet, reserved widow was gone, replaced by someone with the confidence and focus of a seasoned fighter. For the first time, he truly understood what his father had meant when he'd said years ago that his mother was the most formidable person he'd ever known. Outside, the moon cast long shadows across the Blackwood Ranch, as distant hoofbeats signaled the approach of unwelcome visitors. But as they drew closer to the isolated homestead, they remained unaware that they were no longer the hunters. The hunters were about to become the hunted. The following day, as the sun climbed high over Copper Creek, Jackson Vance sat in the private back room of the Silver Dollar Saloon, swirling amber whiskey in a crystal glass that looked out of place. Amid the frontier establishment's rough-hewn furnishings, before him stood 5 men, whose appearances told different stories, but whose eyes shared the same cold calculation. "Gentlemen," Vance said, setting down his glass with deliberate precision, "I've called you here because conventional methods have failed, and time is running short. In 3 weeks, the railroad investors arrive from Chicago. If we haven't secured the Blackwood property by then, they'll reroute through Silverton Pass, and everything I've built here collapses." Silas Kane, a lean, silver-haired man with a face weathered by desert winds and a reputation as the territory's most efficient gun for hire, leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You're not the first businessman to discover that some folks value land over money, Vance. I'm not paying you for philosophy, Kane," Vance snapped. "I'm paying for results." Kane's expression didn't change, just stating facts. "That Blackwood woman turned down $8,000. Most settlers out here would kill for half that." "Which brings us to why you're here," Vance replied, pushing a stack of papers across the table. "These are territorial survey maps from before the war. According to these, the northern third of the Blackwood Ranch sits on land with unclear title. My lawyers have filed a dispute claim," Legal maneuvers take time, Kane observed. Time you don't have. Vance's smile was cold. The legal claim merely provides cover for more immediate solutions. A stocky man with a badly healed scar running from temple to jaw, straightened from his position by the door. This was Maddox, rumored to have ridden with the infamous Harper gang before establishing himself as a problem solver for wealthy interests. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Vance?" Maddox asked, his voice surprisingly cultured for a man with such a brutal appearance. Vance stood, moving to a map of the county pinned to the wall. "The Blackwood Ranch needs to suffer a series of misfortunes. Cattle scattered, fences cut, water supplies threatened. Nothing traceable to us, but enough to convince Sarah Blackwood that holding on to the property is more trouble than it's worth." "And if she still doesn't sell?" asked Ramon Cruz, the youngest of the group, whose quick draw and quicker temper had earned him both respect and wariness throughout the territory. "Then perhaps a tragic accident befalls the property," Vance replied, his tone making it clear he was speaking of more than broken fences. "A fire started by those outlaws everyone's been talking about, so unfortunate, but not unexpected in such remote, lawless country." The fifth man, who had remained silent until now, pushed back his chair. Jeremiah Harlow was broader than the others, with massive shoulders and hands that could crush a man's windpipe as easily as shake his hand. His voice rumbled like distant thunder when he finally spoke. "What about the boy? She's got a son, near grown." A flicker of annoyance crossed Vance's face. "Ethan Blackwood is an untested boy, barely old enough to shave. He'll run at the first sign of serious trouble. If not—" He let the implication hang in the air. Kane studied Vance with renewed interest. "You seem mighty certain about this land. What's really there that's got you willing to go to such lengths?" Vance hesitated, then reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. He emptied its contents onto the table, several rough stones that caught the lamplight with unmistakable golden glints. "And there's a reason I want that particular section of land," Vance said quietly. "The railroad is just the beginning. My geologists confirm there's a substantial vein running through the north ridge of the Blackwood property. Once the railroad comes through, I'll control not just the transportation, but the gold itself." The men exchanged glances, the stakes suddenly much clearer. "Triple your usual rate," Vance continued, "plus a 10% share in the mining venture. For the man who secures me clear title to that land within the week." Kane straightened, his interest fully engaged now. "When do we start?" "Tonight," Vance replied. "The Blackwoods returned to their ranch yesterday evening. I want them to feel pressure immediately. Maddox, take Cruz and start with the outer pastures. Kane, you and Harlow focus on their water supply. Remember, escalating pressure. I want them scared and uncertain before we move to the final phase." As the men filed out, Vance called Kane back. "One more thing. My sources tell me a U.S. Marshal has been seen in the territory, name of Everett, known for tracking down the remnants of border gangs. If he appears, deal with him. Discreetly." Kane's mouth tightened. "Killing a U.S. Marshal is a hanging offense, even in this territory. Then ensure he suffers an unfortunate accident in pursuit of those outlaws everyone's so worried about," Vance replied coldly. "I'm paying you enough to assume certain risks." After the men departed, Mayor Walsh slipped into the room through a side door, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning. "This is going too far, Jackson," he said nervously. "Harassing settlers, threatening marshals. This isn't what I agreed to." Vance poured another whiskey. "You agreed to help me secure the future of Copper Creek, Frank. That's exactly what I'm doing. Besides, you're in too deep to develop a conscience now." The mayor's face paled. "What do you mean?" Vance opened a ledger on the table, turning it toward Walsh. "Those municipal bonds you authorized to finance the initial land purchases? The ones countersigned with slightly irregular permissions? I have all the documentation right here. Walsh slumped into a chair. You promised that was between us. And it remains between us, Vance assured him with a predatory smile, provided you continue supporting our mutual interests. The territorial governor arrives next week. I need you to ensure he signs the emergency jurisdiction transfer placing disputed lands under county control rather than federal. After that, the Blackwood problem will be permanently resolved. As evening approached, Sarah Blackwood stood on a ridge overlooking the north pasture, a brass spyglass raised to her eye as she tracked the movement of riders along her property's edge. Beside her, Ethan crouched behind a boulder, his father's Winchester rifle resting across his knees. 5 of them, Sarah said quietly, collapsing the spyglass. 2 by the creek, 3 heading toward the east pasture where the cattle are grazing. Vance's men? Ethan asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Almost certainly, Sarah replied, too organized to be random bandits. We should confront them, Ethan said, rising to his feet. This is our land. Sarah placed a restraining hand on her son's arm. Not yet. First, we watch. Learn their patterns, their weaknesses. Your father always said knowledge is better ammunition than bullets. The sound of distant gunfire echoed across the valley, followed by the panicked lowing of cattle. Sarah's expression hardened. They're scattering our herd, she said. Come on! They moved through the forest with practiced silence, following game, trails that allowed them to parallel the raiders' route while remaining concealed in the dense undergrowth. When they reached the east pasture, they found fence posts chopped down and cattle being driven in all directions by 2 riders firing pistols into the air. I count 40 heads scattered, Sarah said grimly. It'll take days to round them all. Up, those are Vance's men, all right, Ethan growled, raising his rifle. I can drop the one in the red bandana from here. Sarah firmly pushed the rifle barrel down. No, that's exactly what they want. An excuse to claim we're dangerous, violent, to justify whatever comes next. So we just let them destroy everything. We've built? Ethan demanded, frustration evident in his voice. No, Sarah replied, her eyes narrowing as she studied the men below. We make them understand that this land defends itself. Later that night, as moonlight silvered the pine trees surrounding the Blackwood ranch house, Sarah and Ethan prepared for the confrontation they knew was coming. They had spent hours tracking the raiders, observing their camps, counting weapons, and identifying the leaders. Silas Kane, Sarah had said when they spotted the silver-haired man giving orders. I know him from the border wars. He was a scout for the army before turning hired gun. Dangerous, but he has a code. He won't harm women or children unless directly threatened. What about the others? Ethan had asked. The big one is Harlow. He's muscle, not brains. The scarred one is Maddox, cruel, methodical. Cruz is young but lethal with a pistol. The 5th man stayed back, watching through a spyglass. Probably the one giving orders for Vance. Now, in the ranch house kitchen, Sarah spread out a hand-drawn map of their property. They've camped here by Lost Creek Canyon, she said, marking the spot with a stone. They'll likely hit the south pasture and water reservoir tomorrow. We need help, Ethan said. Maybe some of Pa's old friends. No time, Sarah cut in. Besides, this needs to stay quiet for now. If word spreads that we're under attack, Vance will use it to claim the territory is too dangerous for a woman, and boy to manage alone. A soft knock at the back door interrupted them. Sarah drew her pistol in one fluid motion, signaling Ethan to move to the side of the door. Who's there? She called, her voice steady. An old friend, came the reply. One who owes Thomas a debt. Sarah's eyes widened in recognition. She nodded to Ethan, who unbarred the door. A tall man in a dust-covered duster stepped inside, removing his hat to reveal graying hair and a weathered face crossed with a thin scar along one cheekbone. The silver marshal's badge on his chest caught the lamplight. James Everett, Sarah said, lowering her pistol. It's been a long time. Too long, Sarah. the marshal replied, his voice gravelly. "From years of trail dust and harsh weather. I heard you might be having trouble." "News travels fast," Sarah observed, gesturing for him to sit at the table. "I've been tracking the remnants of the Rattlesnake Gang," Everett explained. "Trail led me to Copper Creek. While there, I couldn't help noticing a land speculator named Vance hiring every gun hand in the territory. When I heard the Blackwood Ranch was involved, I figured I owed it to Thomas to check in. Pa spoke highly of you," Ethan said, studying the newcomer with cautious respect. Everett nodded to the young man. "You've grown since I saw you last. You were knee-high to a grasshopper when your father and I chased the Douglas brothers into Mexico." "How much do you know about our situation?" Sarah asked, bringing the conversation back to the present danger. "Enough," Everett replied grimly. "Vance has filed dubious title disputes on your northern section. Meanwhile, he's hired 5 of the territory's most notorious hired guns to pressure you off the land before the territorial governor arrives next week. What I don't know is why this particular piece of land matters so much to him." Sarah and Ethan exchanged glances. We know," Sarah said finally. She reached into a cabinet and withdrew a metal box, unlocking it with a key she wore around her neck. From inside, she removed several rough gold nuggets. "Thomas found these in the North Ridge 2 years before he died. We kept it quiet, waiting to file a proper claim when the territory became more settled." Everett whistled softly. "That would explain Vance's determination. With the railroad coming through, a gold strike would make him the most powerful man between Denver and Santa Fe." "Can you help us?" Ethan asked. The marshal's face grew serious. "Officially, there's little I can do without evidence of federal crimes. Claim disputes are territorial matters, and fence cutting isn't worth federal attention." "And unofficially," Sarah pressed. Everett smiled slightly. "Unofficially, I owe your husband my life 3 times over, and I've been looking for an excuse to bring down men like Kane and Maddox for years." He leaned forward, studying the map on the table. "But we're outnumbered and outgunned. Going head-to-head with those men would be suicide." "We weren't planning a direct confrontation," Sarah replied, tracing a finger along the borders of their property. "This land has been in the Blackwood family for 3 generations. We know every cave, ravine, and hidden spring. They don't." "You're suggesting we use the terrain against them," Everett said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "Thomas and I spent years as scouts. We mapped every inch of this wilderness. There are places in these mountains where a single defender could hold off 20 attackers, and places where unwary riders might find themselves in natural traps," Ethan added, his young face alight with determination. Everett studied them both, a new respect in his gaze. "Thomas always said you were the best tracker and strategist he'd ever known, Sarah. I'm starting to see why." "Tomorrow they'll hit our water reservoir," Sarah said, pointing to the location on the map. "Instead of trying to stop them, we'll let them think they've succeeded. But we'll be watching, learning their methods. Then, when they report back to Vance that we're weakening, we spring our own trap." Everett finished. Sarah nodded, her eyes glinting with fierce resolve in the lamplight. "Vance thinks he's hunting vulnerable prey. It's time he learned that in these mountains, the Blackwoods are the hunters, not the hunted." As they continued planning late into the night, none of them noticed the figure crouched beneath the kitchen window, listening intently before slipping away into the darkness. Young Ramon Cruz, sent by Kane to scout the ranch house, now hurrying back to report that the situation had become considerably more complicated than Vance had led them to believe. First light had barely kissed the eastern horizon when Sarah Blackwood emerged from a hidden cave entrance halfway up the North Ridge, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp dawn air. Behind her, Marshal Everett ducked through the low opening, straightening with a grunt as he surveyed the valley spread below them. "I'd forgotten how beautiful it is up here," he said quietly, eyes tracing the silver ribbon of the creek winding through pine forests to the distant plains. Sarah nodded, adjusting the rifle slung across her back. Thomas used to say, God created this land to remind men of their proper size. They stood in silence, watching as the golden light spilled across. The landscape, illuminating the Blackwood Ranch, nestled against the protective embrace of the forest. Smoke rose from the chimney where Ethan would be preparing breakfast, maintaining the appearance of normal routine despite the danger surrounding them. This cave system, Everett said, turning to examine the narrow opening. It doesn't appear on any maps. That's intentional, Sarah replied, leading him around a bend to where the passage widened into a substantial chamber. Inside, wooden crates were stacked against one wall, while bedrolls, water barrels and supplies were arranged with military precision. Thomas discovered it during our first winter here. We expanded it over the years, added the side chambers, reinforced the supports. A fallback position, Everett observed with professional appreciation. Among other things, Sarah agreed, moving to the far wall where an arsenal of weapons was arranged. Rifles, shotguns, pistols and boxes of ammunition, carefully organized and maintained. Thomas never stopped being a marshal, even after he hung up his badge, said a man with enemies should always have a place to make a stand if needed. Smart, Everett said, examining the collection. Those aren't standard homesteader weapons. Sarah's hands moved over the firearms with practiced familiarity. Half of these we brought back from our scouting days. The rest Thomas acquired over the years. He had friends in the army who understood his situation. His situation? Sarah's expression tightened momentarily. The Rattlesnake Gang didn't target that stagecoach randomly. Their leader, Frank Mackenzie, had a personal vendetta against Thomas from when Thomas put his brother in territorial prison. She selected a Sharps buffalo rifle from the rack, checking its action with practiced hands. Thomas always said they'd come for him someday. He made sure we were prepared. And now Vance's men are coming instead, Everett noted grimly. Different men, same threat, Sarah replied, handing him the Sharps. This one's sighted for distance. You'll need it for what I have in mind. As they continued their preparations, Everett studied Sarah with new understanding. The quiet rancher's widow was transforming before his eyes into the formidable scout Thomas had often described, with admiration bordering on awe. Her movements were precise, her instructions clear and tactical, her knowledge of both the terrain and combat strategy evident in every word. Thomas told me once that you saved an entire cavalry patrol from an ambush, Everett said, as they packed specific supplies into rucksacks. Said you read sign no one else could see, tracked a war party that had eluded their best scouts. Sarah's hands paused briefly. That was a lifetime ago. Skills like that don't fade, Sarah, especially when they're needed. She shouldered her pack, a ghost of a smile crossing her face. No, they don't, which is why Vance and his men have already made their first mistake. What's that? They think they're dealing with a grieving widow and her inexperienced son, Sarah said, moving toward a narrow passage that led deeper into the mountain. They have no idea what's waiting for them in these woods. Down at the ranch house, Ethan Blackwood moved through his morning chores with deliberate visibility, feeding livestock and mending a corral fence where the cattle had been driven through it the previous day. His rifle leaned against a nearby post, close at hand but not overtly threatening. From his peripheral vision, he spotted the glint of a spyglass from a distant ridge. One of Vance's men watching, as expected. Ethan continued working, playing the role of the earnest young rancher, struggling to maintain the property alone, while his mother was supposedly in town seeking help from the territorial authorities. A story they had deliberately leaked through. A staged conversation at the ranch perimeter. As he worked, Ethan's mind replayed the revealing conversation from the previous night, after Cruz had slipped away from the ranch house window. They'll report back that a US Marshal is involved now, Everett had said, cleaning his revolver at the kitchen table. Vance will have to accelerate his plans. Good, Sarah had replied, her voice steady. The tighter his timeline, the more mistakes he'll make. What makes you so sure? Ethan had asked. Sarah's eyes had met his across the table. Because men, like Vance, rely on fear and force, not strategy. When pressed, they reach for the most direct solution, not the wisest one. Now, as Ethan drove nails into the fence post with precise, powerful blows, he sensed movement in the tree line to the east. Without turning his head, he registered 2 riders moving parallel to the property edge, keeping to the shadows of the pines. That's right, he murmured to himself, driving another nail with theatrical effort. Think I'm just a boy over my head, worried about fixing fences while you circle closer. By midday, Ethan had completed the fence repairs and moved on to checking the livestock water troughs, positioning himself perfectly to witness the next phase of Vance's harassment campaign without appearing to notice it. Right on schedule, a small herd of mustangs burst from the northern tree line, driven by unseen riders toward the grazing cattle. The startled cattle scattered in panic, some breaking through the freshly repaired fence while others bolted toward the creek. Ethan made a show of desperate, futile pursuit, even firing a warning shot into the air that he knew would be useless against the chaos. All the while, he noted the positions of the hidden riders, their tactics, and most importantly, their access and escape routes. When the dust settled, nearly half the Blackwood cattle had been scattered across 3 valleys, and the wild mustangs had disappeared back into the forest. Ethan stood in the middle of the trampled pasture, shoulders slumped in apparent defeat, hat thrown to the ground in frustration. A perfect picture of a young man overwhelmed by forces beyond his control as he trudged back toward the house, head down, rifle dragging carelessly in the dust. Ethan felt a grim satisfaction. The performance had served its purpose. Vance's men would report that the Blackwood boy was at his breaking point, the perfect time to apply the final pressure. What they couldn't see was the meticulously detailed map taking shape in Ethan's mind. Every scouting position and attack angle now committed to memory, ready to be added to his mother's strategic plans. Meanwhile, deep in the forest that crowned the North Ridge, Sarah and Marshal Everett had spent hours preparing the terrain itself to become their ally in the coming conflict. At strategic points along the main game trails, Sarah knelt beside a narrow stream, deftly constructing a deadfall trigger, using only materials that appeared naturally placed. "Thomas taught you this?" Everett asked, watching her hands work with impressive speed and precision. "Some of it," Sarah replied, carefully balancing a triggering stone. "The rest I learned from Apache scouts during the border campaigns. They could make the land itself seem to rise up against intruders." "Non-lethal," Everett confirmed, examining her handiwork. "For now," Sarah said, her tone making it clear that could change if circumstances demanded. "These are designed to unhorse riders and separate them from each other. Isolation makes men easier to manage." By late afternoon, they had established a network of traps, blinds, and false trails throughout the section of forest between the ranch house and the cave system. Nothing that would kill, as Everett had insisted on maintaining at least the appearance of lawful methods, but enough to control the movement of unwanted visitors and funnel them exactly where Sarah wanted them to go. "There's one more place I need to show you," Sarah said, as the shadows lengthened, leading Everett toward what appeared to be an impenetrable thicket of brambles and fallen timber. To his surprise, she disappeared into the tangle with practiced ease, following a path invisible to the untrained eye. Everett followed cautiously, finding himself in a narrow passage that eventually opened into a small clearing surrounded by dense foliage. In the center stood a crude cabin, weathered by years of exposure but still structurally sound. "Thomas's grandfather built this during the early settlement days," Sarah explained, producing a key from her pocket to unlock the heavy wooden door. "A safe house when raiding parties were active in the territory. Inside, the single-room structure was sparse but functional. A stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture and shelves stocked with preserved foods and essential supplies. But what caught Everett's attention was the ingenious design of the cabin itself. Its single window provided a commanding view of the only approach, while the thick log walls were pierced with narrow gun ports at strategic heights and angles. A defensive position, he noted appreciatively. The last place anyone would look for us, Sarah confirmed, and the perfect place to stage the final confrontation with Vance's men. Everett's brow furrowed. You're planning to lure them here? Not all of them, Sarah replied, unfolding a hand-drawn map across the simple table. Just the ones who follow Ethan into the forest. You're using your son as bait? Everett asked, his voice sharp with concern. Sarah's eyes met his, steady and certain. I'm using their assumptions against them. They see a boy when they look at Ethan, not the young man Thomas trained since he could walk. The forest holds no fears for him. He knows every trail and hidden place. They'll think they're chasing easy prey into these woods, not realizing he's leading them exactly where we want them. It's still a significant risk, Everett pointed out. Life out here is risk, James, Sarah replied, her voice softening slightly. Thomas and I never sheltered Ethan from that truth. We prepared him for it instead. As she spoke, Sarah moved to a loose floorboard, prying it up to reveal a hidden compartment. From within, she withdrew an oilskin-wrapped package, carefully unfolding it to reveal a pair of finely crafted Colt revolvers with custom grips inlaid with silver. Thomas's matching set, Everett recognized, his voice respectful. He commissioned them after Ethan was born, Sarah confirmed, checking the action with practiced hands. Said they'd be Ethan's someday, when he was ready to carry the responsibility they represented. She holstered one at her hip and wrapped the other carefully. That day has come sooner than we expected. You're giving it to him now? Sarah's eyes held a mixture of maternal concern and fierce pride. A boy defends himself with whatever is at hand. A man chooses his weapons with purpose and carries them with honor. It's time Ethan understood the difference. As they prepared to return to the ranch house under the cover of approaching darkness, Everett found himself re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about Sarah Blackwood. The quiet widow had revealed herself to be a tactician and wilderness expert whose skills rivaled any he'd encountered in his years as a marshal. Thomas always said you were the most capable person he'd ever met, Everett observed, as they moved silently through the deepening shadows. I understand now what he meant. Sarah paused briefly, her silhouette outlined against the dying light. We all have parts of ourselves we keep hidden, Marshal, sometimes by choice, sometimes by necessity. She adjusted her rifle strap and continued forward. Tomorrow, Vance's men will discover that what they thought was vulnerability was actually a carefully crafted illusion. And what happens then? Everett asked. Sarah's voice carried a quiet certainty that sent a chill down his spine, despite the warmth of the evening. Then they learn why 3 generations of Blackwoods have held this land against all comers. Not because it contains gold, but because it contains us. Back at Copper Creek, Jackson Vance paced the floor of his luxurious hotel suite, impatience radiating from every movement as Silas Kane delivered his report. The situation has complexities you failed to mention, Kane said, his weathered face impassive as he recounted what Cruz had overheard at the ranch house window. U.S. Marshal James Everett is involved now, and Sarah Blackwood isn't just some rancher's widow. She was a military scout with tracking skills that apparently rival my own. Vance dismissed this with an irritated wave. One aging lawman and a woman who once guided soldiers hardly changes our advantage. You have 5 experienced gunmen against a marshal past his prime, a woman and a boy. You're underestimating them, Kane warned, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had survived decades on the frontier by respecting worthy adversaries. The land itself favors them. They know every inch of that territory. Which is precisely why we can't wait any longer, Vance snapped, slamming his fist on the ornate desk. The territorial governor arrives in 4 days. By then, I need either the Blackwood signatures on these sale documents or clear evidence that the property has been abandoned due to outlaw activity in the region. Kane's eyes narrowed slightly. What exactly are you suggesting? Tomorrow night, you'll implement the final phase, Vance instructed, pouring himself a generous measure of brandy from a crystal decanter. The boy is your primary target. Cruz reports he's been working the property alone all day, clearly overwhelmed. Separate him from his mother and the marshal. Once isolated, present him with the sale documents. If he resists, Kane prompted, his voice carefully neutral. Vance's smile was cold and calculating. Then ensure he becomes permanently lost in that vast wilderness they're so proud of. A tragic accident, a young man vanishing in the dangerous frontier. So, common out here, wouldn't you agree? Kane studied Vance silently for a long moment. And the mother? The marshal? Without the boy, the woman will have no choice but to sell, Vance replied dismissively. As for Everett, he's one man, far from backup and official jurisdiction. Handle him as necessary. After Kane departed, Vance returned to the window, gazing toward the distant mountains where the Blackwood Ranch lay shrouded in darkness. His fingers drummed impatiently on the gold watch chain stretched across his waistcoat. One more day, he murmured to himself, anticipation of imminent victory washing away any flicker of conscience that might have remained. One more day, and all that gold is mine. What he couldn't see, in the gathering darkness beyond the town's lights, was the silent figure of Ethan Blackwood. The young man had slipped into Copper Creek undetected, using the skills his parents had taught him since childhood. Now he crouched beneath the hotel's rear window, having heard every word of Vance's murderous plans. With the final pieces of intelligence secured, Ethan melted back into the shadows, mounting his horse at the edge of town and setting off toward the mountains at a gallop. By dawn, the Blackwoods would be fully prepared for Vance's endgame, not as victims awaiting their fate, but as hunters who had deliberately drawn their prey into carefully laid traps. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and Shadowpine Forest was about to earn a new reputation in the lore of the frontier. Dawn painted the horizon with streaks of crimson and gold as Silas Kane led his 4 men along the ridge above the Blackwood Ranch. Each rider sat tall in the saddle, weapons within easy reach, expressions grim in the early morning light. Behind them, dark storm clouds gathered over the distant peaks, promising rough weather before nightfall. Remember, Kane instructed as they reined in at a vantage point overlooking the property. Vance wants this to look like outlaw activity, not a coordinated attack. Cruz and Harlow, you drive off any remaining cattle and cut the fence lines. Make it look like random destruction. Maddox and I will handle the boy. And if the marshal appears? Maddox asked, checking the load in his Remington revolver. Leave him to me, Kane replied, his weathered face giving nothing away. Just remember, separate the boy, isolate him in the forest. If he signs the papers, fine. If not... He let the implication hang in the air. Cruz, the youngest of the group, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. The boy's just defending his home, same as any of us would. Kane's cold eyes settled on the young gunman. Having second thoughts? Just saying maybe there's a line we shouldn't cross, Cruz muttered. You crossed that line when you took Vance's money. Maddox cut in sharply. Too late for a conscience now. Enough, Kane ordered. We move on my signal. Remember, make this look like random violence, not a targeted attack. As they waited for full daylight, none of the men noticed the subtle flash of sunlight on glass. From the ridge behind them, Marshal Everett, tracking their movements through a spyglass. Exactly as Sarah had predicted, Ethan Blackwood emerged from the barn, leading his saddled horse, rifle securely in its scabbard, his father's Colt revolver now holstered at his hip, the weight of it both unfamiliar and somehow right. He moved, with deliberate visibility, making a show of checking supplies in his saddlebags while scanning the surrounding ridgelines through narrowed eyes. He knew they were watching. He could feel their presence like a weight on the back of his neck, that sixth sense his father had tried to teach him, the awareness that separated survivors from victims on the frontier. Mounting up, Ethan rode toward the east pasture where the remaining cattle grazed, following the plan he and his mother had carefully crafted. He would be the bait, drawing Vance's men into terrain chosen specifically for what would follow. He had ridden barely half a mile when the crack of rifles split the morning quiet. Bullets kicked up dirt 20 yards ahead, deliberately missing. But close enough to scatter the cattle in panicked confusion. Ethan reined his horse hard, making a convincing show of surprise and alarm as riders emerged from the tree line, whooping and firing into the air. "That's far enough, boy," Maddox called out, his scarred face twisted in a cruel smile as he and Kane approached from the west, while Cruz and Harlow drove the cattle through broken fence lines to the east. Ethan made a show of reaching for his rifle, then stopping as Kane drew down on him with practiced speed. "Wouldn't advise that," the silver-haired gunman warned. "We're just here to talk business." "Destroying our ranch is business," Ethan demanded, his voice cracking with what appeared to be youthful fear, but was in fact perfectly calculated performance. "What do you want?" "Same thing we've always wanted," Maddox replied, producing a folded document from inside his coat. "Your signature on these sale papers, $8,000, and all your troubles disappear." "And if I refuse?" Ethan challenged, subtly shifting his horse's position, angling toward the dense forest to the north, exactly where they needed him to flee. "Then your troubles get considerably worse," Maddox promised, his hand resting meaningfully on his holstered revolver. "Where's your mother and that marshal friend of yours?" "Rode to the territorial office early this morning," Ethan lied smoothly. "Should be back with reinforcements by nightfall." Kane studied the young man carefully, trying to determine if he was bluffing. "Then you're out here all alone. Not a wise position to take a stand." Ethan's eyes darted between the men, then toward the forest, the picture of a young man calculating desperate odds. "I don't need reinforcements to tell you the same thing my mother already did. This land isn't for sale." "Wrong answer," Maddox snarled, drawing his revolver in one fluid motion. Ethan was already moving, spurring his horse into a sudden gallop, ducking low in the saddle as bullets whined overhead. The performance was convincing. A frightened young man fleeing for his life, but underneath the facade, Ethan was counting seconds, measuring distances, leading his pursuers exactly where he wanted them to go. "After him!" Maddox shouted, wheeling his horse around. "Don't let him reach the ranch house." Kane held up a restraining hand. "Cruz, Harlow, finish with the cattle, then circle around to cut off his route back to the house. Maddox and I will drive him deeper into the forest." The men separated, Kane and Maddox thundering after Ethan into the dense pines, while Cruz and Harlow continued their destructive work, unaware of the trap they were all galloping into. From her position on a rocky outcrop half a mile into the forest, Sarah watched the pursuit through her spyglass. Beside her, Marshal Everett checked the load in the Sharps rifle she had provided. "Ethan's leading them perfectly," she observed, pride evident in her voice despite the danger her son was facing. "Kane and Maddox are following, just as we predicted. Cruz and Harlow are staying behind," Everett noted. "That complicates things." "It's actually better," Sarah replied, collapsing the spyglass with a practiced motion. "Dividing their forces makes them more vulnerable. Ethan will handle Kane and Maddox. We'll circle back for the others." Everett raised an eyebrow. "You're confident in the boy's abilities." Sarah's expression softened momentarily. "He's not a boy anymore, James. Not after today. She checked her own rifle with methodical precision. "Take position at the Lightning Ridge overlook. You'll have clear shots if needed. And you," Sarah secured her hat against the rising wind. "I'm going to remind Cruz and Harlow why locals fear these woods." Before Everett could respond, Sarah was gone, disappearing into the underbrush with a silence and speed that belied her years. The marshal shook his head in grudging admiration before making his way toward the designated position. Thomas had not exaggerated his wife's capabilities. If anything, he had understated them. Deep in the forest, Ethan guided his horse through a labyrinth of narrow game trails, always staying just visible enough to keep his pursuers on his trail, but never close enough for a clean shot. The thundering hooves behind him told him Kane and Maddox were following exactly as planned, their mounts struggling on terrain they didn't know. Reaching a fork in the trail, Ethan veered sharply left, ducking under low-hanging branches and leaping a small stream before cutting back through dense underbrush to a position where he could observe his pursuers without being seen. Kane and Maddox reached the fork moments later, reining their lathered horses to a halt as they searched for signs of Ethan's passage. "Left fork," Maddox said confidently, pointing to disturbed vegetation. "He's making for the high ground." Kane frowned, studying the trail with a tracker's experienced eye. "Too obvious. The boy knows these woods." Nevertheless, he followed Maddox down the left fork, caution evident in his posture. Ethan waited until they passed, then circled behind them, now the pursuer rather than the pursued. He guided his horse with subtle pressure from his knees, leaving his hands free for what would come next. Reaching into his saddlebag, he removed a small leather pouch and loosened the drawstring. Ahead, the trail Kane and Maddox followed narrowed between two massive boulders, the perfect location for the first stage of his plan. Ethan urged his horse into a quick trot, closing the distance until he could just make out the riders through the trees. Then, with practiced precision, he flung the pouch high over their heads, watching as it burst against a tree trunk directly in their path. A cloud of fine red dust exploded outward, startling the horses and filling the air with what appeared to be blood, but was actually a mixture of iron oxide and powdered clay, a trick his mother had learned from native scouts years ago. The effect was instantaneous. Maddox's horse reared in panic, throwing him from the saddle into the rocky ground with bone-jarring force. Kane managed to control his mount, but only by fighting it to a standstill while it snorted and rolled, its eyes in fear. "It's a trick!" Kane shouted, drawing his revolver as Maddox struggled to his feet, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "The boys circled behind us." Ethan was already moving, guiding his horse off the trail into dense underbrush, leading the gunman deeper into the forest's embrace. The storm clouds overhead had darkened, and distant thunder rolled across the mountains as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. Perfect weather for what came next. Back at the eastern pasture, Cruz and Harlow had finished scattering the remaining cattle and were systematically destroying fence lines and water troughs when the sky opened up. Rain poured down in blinding sheets, turning the dusty ground to mud within minutes and reducing visibility to mere yards. "We should find shelter," Cruz called over the roar of the downpour. "Wait out the worst of it." Harlow shook his head, water streaming from the brim of his hat. "Kane said to circle around and cut off the boys' escape route." "That's what we're doing. Can barely see 50 feet in this," Cruz protested, "and something about these woods don't feel right. Getting superstitious in your old age." Harlow mocked, though his eyes darted nervously to the wall of trees looming through the rain. "Not superstition," Cruz insisted. "Instinct, like we're being watched." They were indeed being watched, though neither man could see Sarah Blackwood, moving parallel to their position, silent as a shadow despite the deluge. She had circled ahead of them, laying her traps with practiced efficiency before taking position at a natural choke point where the meadow narrowed into a wooded draw. As the two riders approached, Sarah notched an arrow to the sinew string of a compact hunting bow, a weapon she had carried since her scouting days, chosen now for its silence and precision. The first arrow flew true, striking the ground between Harlow's horse's front legs with a solid thunk. The startled animal reared, fighting the bit as Harlow struggled to maintain control. "What the hell?" The second arrow whispered through the rain, striking the canteen hanging from Cruz's saddle with enough force to tear it free, the metallic clang causing both horses to shy in panic. "Someone's shooting at us," Cruz shouted, drawing his revolver and firing blindly into the surrounding forest. "Not shooting," Harlow corrected grimly, eyes scanning the tree line. "Hunting." A third arrow struck the ground at Harlow's feet as he dismounted, the shaft vibrating with the impact. Tied to it was a strip of red cloth, a warning that needed no translation on the frontier. Cruz, younger and more impressionable, felt his nerve breaking. "This is crazy, Harlow. We're being toyed with." "Shut up and keep your eyes open," Harlow snapped, though his own face had paled beneath its weather-beaten tan. "It's just one woman and a boy." "Is it?" Sarah's voice echoed from somewhere in the surrounding trees, impossible to pinpoint through the driving rain. "Are you certain of that, Mr. Harlow?" Both men spun, guns raised, firing at shadows and finding nothing. "These woods have claimed many men over the years," Sarah's voice continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Some to accident, some to the elements, some to their own fear. How will you be remembered, I wonder?" "Show yourself," Harlow demanded, his usual confidence cracking under the psychological pressure. "I'm right here," Sarah replied suddenly, visible through the curtain of rain, standing 20 yards away with her rifle raised. "This is your one chance to leave. Drop your weapons, mount up, and ride back to Vance. Tell him the Blackwood land is not for sale. Not today, not ever." Harlow's face contorted with rage and embarrassment. "You think you can threaten us? There's two of us and one of you, woman." "Count again," came Marshal Everett's voice from behind them. The men turned to find the lawman positioned on a rise. 30 yards back, the Sharp's rifle aimed with unwavering precision. Cruz immediately raised his hands. "I'm not dying for Vance's gold. This has gone too far." "Smart boy," Sarah said, her voice carrying easily despite the storm. "What about you, Harlow? Is this land worth dying for when it isn't even yours to claim?" Harlow's eyes darted between Sarah and Everett, calculating odds that grew worse by the second. With a curse, he dropped his revolver into the mud. "Wise decision," Sarah said, stepping forward to collect their weapons. "Now, you have a choice. You can sit out this storm tied to those trees over there, or you can deliver a message to your employer." "What message?" Cruz asked, relief evident in his young face. Sarah's expression hardened. "Tell Vance that if anything happens to my son, I will hold him personally responsible, and unlike your friend Kane, I don't leave loose ends." The implied threat hung in the air, made more ominous by her matter-of-fact delivery. "What about Kane and Maddox?" Harlow demanded. "They're still after the boy." "No," Sarah corrected with quiet confidence. "By now, they're the ones being hunted. Deep. In Shadowpine Forest, where ancient trees blocked much of the rain but left the ground treacherous with sudden streams and mud, Ethan Blackwood had transformed from prey to predator. Moving with the assured confidence of someone born to this wilderness, he circled and doubled back, leaving false trails and misleading signs that had Kane and Maddox trudging through the worst terrain. "The boy's making fools of us," Maddox growled, limping from his earlier fall as they slogged through a muddy ravine. "He's leading us in circles." Kane, whose reputation as a tracker was well earned, said nothing, but the growing frustration in his eyes spoke volumes. The easy job, Vance had promised, intimidating a widow and frightening a green boy, had become something else entirely. These weren't the actions of an inexperienced youth, but the calculated strategy of someone trained in wilderness warfare. A snapping twig to their right brought both men's guns up. but it was only a startled deer bounding away through the underbrush. We should go back, Maddox suggested, nerves showing through his usual bravado. This storm's getting worse, and we're cut off from Cruz and Harlow. And tell Vance what? Kane demanded. That we were outmaneuvered by a boy? Better than not returning to tell him anything, Maddox muttered. Before Kane could respond, a low whistle echoed through the trees, a perfect imitation of a mountain bluebird, except no bluebird would be calling in a storm like this. Both men froze, instinctively recognizing a signal when they heard one. He's not alone, Kane realized, eyes narrowing as he scanned the surrounding forest. The next instant confirmed his suspicion as a lasso whipped down from an overhanging branch, settling around Maddox's shoulders before yanking tight, pulling the startled gunman off his feet and dragging him several yards through the mud before he could draw his knife to cut himself free. Kane fired at movement in the trees, bark splintering where Ethan had been moments before. The young man was already moving, circling to another position with a speed and silence that belied his years. "Your quarry knows the ground better than you do, Mr. Kane," Ethan called, his voice seeming to come from multiple directions in the rain-soaked forest. "That's the first rule of tracking, isn't it? Know the territory." Kane's weathered face registered surprise at being addressed by name. "You're well informed for a ranch boy." "I'm more than a ranch boy," Ethan replied. "Now, somewhere to Kane's left, just like my mother is more than a widow." Maddox, having freed himself from the rope, scrambled to Kane's side, mud-covered and furious. "Stop playing games and face us, boy." "Why would I do that?" Ethan's disembodied voice asked reasonably. "You came here to kill me. Seems fair I choose." The terms of our meeting. Kane, whose survival instincts had been honed through decades on the frontier, felt the situation shifting dangerously. The terrain, the weather, the unseen presence tracking them, all advantages were with the Blackwoods. "Not with them. We came to deliver a business proposition," Kane called out, playing for time as he tried to pinpoint Ethan's location. "Vance is prepared to be very generous." A low, humorless laugh echoed through the trees. "Generous? Is that what you call threatening a woman's home and hunting her son through his own forest? Strange definition, Mr. Kane." "It's just business," Maddox growled. "Nothing personal." "It became personal when you crossed our fence line," Ethan replied, his voice hardening. "When you scattered our cattle and destroyed property that 3 generations of my family built." Something in the young man's tone sent a chill through Kane that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through his coat. This wasn't fear or desperation speaking. This was controlled anger, the same tone he'd heard from seasoned fighters who knew exactly what they were doing. "What do you want?" Kane asked finally, recognizing the need to negotiate rather than threaten. "I want you to drop your weapons and walk back to Copper Creek," Ethan said, suddenly visible on a rise 20 yards ahead, his father's Colt revolver held with the steady confidence of someone who knew how to use it. "Tell Vance his gold will stay buried in Blackwood land," Maddox sneered, raising his revolver despite the mud fouling its mechanism. "You don't have the nerve to pull that trigger, boy." The crack of Ethan's pistol coincided perfectly with a lightning strike, the bullet kicking up mud inches from Maddox's boot. "Next one won't miss," Ethan promised, his young face set with determination beyond his years. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 8 years old. Been practicing every day since." Kane slowly raised his hands, empty of weapons, his experienced eyes recognizing the stance and grip of someone properly trained. "The boy's right, Maddox. We've lost this round." "You're giving up?" Maddox demanded incredulously, "to a wet behind the ears." "Look around you," Kane cut him off sharply. "We're in his territory, separated from the others, in the middle of a storm. These aren't winning odds." As if to emphasize his point, the distinctive metallic click of a rifle being cocked echoed from somewhere to their right. Ethan hadn't come alone after all. Maddox hesitated, his face a mask of frustrated rage, before finally dropping his revolver into the mud. "Wise choice," Ethan said, moving forward to collect their weapons while maintaining a careful distance. "The storm's getting worse. There's a line shack half a mile east of here. You can wait it out there until first light, then ride back to town." Kane studied the young man with new respect. "You're not what I expected, Ethan Blackwood." "No." Ethan agreed, a hint of his father's steady gaze in his eyes. "I'm not what any of you expected. That was your mistake." As Kane and Maddox trudged eastward toward the line shack, Ethan remained on the rise, rain streaming down his face, the weight of his father's revolver solid and reassuring in his hand. For the first time in his life, he understood what his parents had tried to teach him all these years, not just how to survive in this wilderness, but how to be its master. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Blackwood legacy was secure in his hands. The storm that had swept across Shadowpine Forest finally broke as dusk approached, leaving a strange stillness in its wake. Puddles reflected the emerging stars, and mist rose from the saturated earth like wandering spirits. Jackson Vance paced the ornate carpet of his hotel suite, repeatedly checking his gold pocket watch as the hours passed without word from his hired men. A sharp knock interrupted his brooding. Mayor Walsh entered without waiting for permission, his face pale and agitated. "Your men are back," Walsh announced, wiping rain from his thinning hair. "Some of them, at least." Vance's head snapped up. "What do you mean, some of them?" Before Walsh could answer, Cruz and Harlow pushed past him into the room. Both men were mud-splattered and grim-faced, their usual swagger replaced by something approaching fear. "Where are Kane and Maddox?" Vance demanded, taking in their disheveled appearance and missing weapons. "Still out there, for all we know," Harlow growled, helping himself to Vance's brandy without asking permission. "Those woods, they're not natural." Vance's lip curled in disgust. "I'm paying for professional gunmen, not superstitious children. What happened?" Cruz sank into a chair, his young face haggard. "The woman, she isn't what you described. And the boy, he led Kane and Maddox into the forest like he planned it." "They were waiting for us," Harlow added, draining his glass in one swallow. "The woman and that marshal had us in their sights before we even knew what was happening." "You're telling me a widow, a boy, and an aging marshal outmaneuvered 5 experienced gun hands?" Vance's voice dripped with scorn. "They didn't outgun us," Cruz corrected, meeting Vance's gaze with unexpected steadiness. "They outsmarted us, used the forest itself against us." "They sent us with a message," Harlow interrupted, refilling his glass despite Vance's glare. "The widow says if anything happens to her son, she'll hold you personally responsible, said she doesn't leave loose ends." A flicker of genuine concern crossed Vance's face before he mastered it. "Empty threats from a desperate woman." "You weren't." "There," Cruz said quietly. "There was nothing desperate about her. She was calculating, like she'd done this before." The door burst open again, admitting a breathless clerk from the telegraph office. "Urgent message for you, Mr. Vance," he announced, thrusting a yellow paper forward. Vance snatched the telegram, his face darkening as he read its contents. "The territorial governor's train arrived in Santa Fe today. He'll be here tomorrow morning." "A full day early." Mayor Walsh paled further. "But that means—" "It means we've run out of time," Vance snapped, crumpling the telegram in his fist. "The land dispute petition has to be presented before he meets with the territorial judge, or we lose everything." "Perhaps it's time to consider other options," Walsh suggested cautiously. "Other routes for the railroad, perhaps?" Vance rounded, on him eyes blazing. "There are no other options. The Silverton Pass route would cost 3 times as much to develop. My investors will pull out, and everything I've built here collapses." His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Everything you've helped me build, Frank. Remember that." Walsh swallowed hard, nodding his understanding of the implicit threat. Vance turned back to Cruz and Harlow. "Where's the boy now?" "Last we saw, He was in the forest with Kane and Maddox, Cruz replied. A calculating expression crossed Vance's face. And the woman and Marshall? Headed back toward the ranch house, Harlow reported. Probably checking on damage we caused before the storm hit. Vance nodded slowly, a plan forming. So they're separated, the boy in the forest, the woman and Marshall at the ranch. He moved to his traveling chest, unlocking it to reveal a custom Remington rifle with elaborate engraving. Sometimes, gentlemen, if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself. Cruz shifted uncomfortably. What are you planning? A simple business transaction, Vance replied, checking the rifle's action with practiced hands. The boy for the land, a fair exchange. You can't be serious, Walsh protested. Kidnapping is a federal offense. Not kidnapping, Vance corrected coldly. Leverage, and only if we're caught, which we won't be. He turned to Cruz and Harlow. You two know where the boy was last seen. You'll guide me there. I didn't sign up for this, Cruz declared, standing abruptly. Threatening a woman and boy is one thing, but what you're talking about is exactly what you signed up for, Vance interrupted, leveling the rifle at Cruz's chest. Unless you'd prefer I inform the authorities about your involvement in that stage robbery near Tucson last year? I make it a point to know exactly who I'm hiring, Mr. Cruz. The young gunman froze, mouth opening and closing wordlessly. That's better, Vance said, lowering the rifle. Now, saddle fresh horses. We leave immediately. In the heart of Shadow Pine Forest, Ethan Blackwood moved like a shadow through the gathering darkness, every sense alert to the sounds and movements around him. The storm had reshaped the landscape, turning familiar trails into streams and creating new passages where fallen trees had altered the terrain. He paused at the base of a massive pine, listening intently. The forest was coming alive with night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. But something else had caught his attention. A rhythmic splash of hooves through muddy ground, approaching from the south. Riders, moving with purpose, despite the darkness and treacherous conditions. Ethan melted deeper into the shadows, circling to higher ground where he could observe without being seen. Through a gap in the trees, he caught the gleam of lantern light and the silhouettes of 3 riders picking their way carefully along the saturated forest trail. He recognized Cruz and Harlow immediately. But the 3rd rider made his blood run. Cold, even in the dim light, the distinctive profile of Jackson Vance was unmistakable, as was the rifle cradled across his saddle. They were hunting him now. Not just Vance's hired guns, but Vance himself. The stakes had risen considerably. Ethan retreated silently, making his way toward the hidden cabin where he knew Kane and Maddox were secured. His mother and Marshall Everett had left the gunman there, bound but unharmed, while they returned to check on the ranch house. They had planned to collect the prisoners in the morning once the storm passed. That plan needed to change now. Reaching the cabin, Ethan slipped inside to find Kane and Maddox seated back to back, bound to sturdy chairs. Both men looked up in surprise as he entered. "Your boss is in the forest," Ethan announced without preamble, moving to the small window to check. For pursuers. Brought Cruz and Harlow back with him. They're looking for me. Kane's weathered face registered no surprise. Vance doesn't handle failure well, or witnesses. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, pausing in his surveillance. "He means your lives aren't the only ones at risk now," Maddox explained, surprising. Ethan with his candor. "Cruz and Harlow failed him, so did we. In Vance's world, that makes us liabilities. Why are you telling me this?" Ethan demanded suspiciously. Kane met his gaze steadily. "Because despite what you might think, boy, there are lines some men won't cross. Threatening a woman and her son for a business deal, that's one thing. But what Vance is planning now?" He shook his head grimly. "That's something else entirely." Ethan studied both men, weighing their words against his instincts. "What exactly is he planning?" He never shared details, Kane replied. But I've worked for men like him before. When they get desperate, they get dangerous. And if he's come out here himself instead of sending more hired guns... He left the implication hanging. Making a swift decision, Ethan drew his knife and moved behind the men. If I cut you loose, what happens next? We help you stop Vance, Kane said without hesitation. Why would you do that? Because, contrary to what you might believe, we still have a code, Kane answered, his voice carrying the weight of years on the frontier. And because your mother spared us when she could have ended things differently, that creates a debt. After a moment's hesitation, Ethan cut through their bonds. My mother always said, you can tell a man's character by the debts he chooses to honor. Smart woman, Kane observed, rubbing circulation back into his wrists as he stood. She reminds me of someone I rode with years ago, Army Scout during the border campaigns. Same methodical mind, same quiet confidence. That would be my mother, Ethan confirmed, a hint of pride in his voice. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell before she married my father. Recognition dawned in Kane's eyes. The ghost? She was legendary among scouts. They said she could track a shadow across bare rock. Still can, Ethan replied. Now we need to move. Vance and the others are circling toward the North Ridge. Where your mother and the marshal are headed, Maddox surmised, checking the small hideaway pistol the Blackwoods had missed in their search, a fact he chose not to mention. Ethan nodded grimly. They're walking into a trap they don't know exists. Sarah, Blackwood and Marshal Everett picked their way carefully along the muddy trail leading back to the ranch house, moonlight occasionally breaking through the clouds to illuminate their path. They moved in companionable silence, two veterans of the frontier, comfortable with each other and the wilderness around them. Ethan handled himself well today, Everett observed finally. Thomas would have been proud. Sarah's face softened in the darkness. He's becoming the man his father hoped he'd be, strong but fair, capable but compassionate, like his mother. Everett added with a sidelong glance. Before she could respond, Sarah froze, raising her hand in warning. Everett immediately halted, years of experience teaching him to trust her instincts without question. Riders ahead, she whispered, melting off the trail into the shadows of the trees. 3 of them, moving quietly. Everett followed, positioning himself behind a massive trunk as the sounds of approaching horses grew louder. Through gaps in the foliage, they watched as 3 figures emerged into a small clearing, dismounting to examine the ground by lantern. Light! The trail splits here, Cruz's voice carried clearly in the night air. The ranch house is that way, but there's fresh sign heading toward the North Ridge. The boy? Vance demanded, holding his lantern closer to the churned mud. Could be, Harlow replied. Hard to tell after the storm. We'll split up, Vance decided. Cruz, take the trail to the ranch house. Harlow and I will follow these tracks to the ridge. If you find the woman or the marshal, fire 3 shots. If you find the boy, fire 2. And then what? Cruz asked, his reluctance evident. Then you secure them until I arrive, Vance replied coldly. Don't make me explain myself twice, Cruz. The men remounted and separated, Cruz heading west toward the ranch, while Vance and Harlow continued north along the ridge trail, directly toward Sarah and Everett's position. They're hunting Ethan, Sarah whispered, her face hardening in the fragmented moonlight. And us, Everett added grimly. Vance has escalated beyond hired guns. He's taking matters into his own hands now. That makes him more dangerous, Sarah observed, checking her rifle, but also more vulnerable. He doesn't know these woods like we do. What's your play? Everett asked, deferring to her superior knowledge. Of the terrain, Sarah considered briefly. You circle back, follow Cruz, make sure he doesn't reach the ranch house. I'll track Vance and Harlow, lead them away from Ethan's last position. Splitting up is risky, Everett cautioned. So is letting armed men hunt my son, Sarah countered, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that brooked no argument. Be careful, James. Cruz may look young, but he's dangerous. So am I, Everett replied with a grim smile, disappearing into the undergrowth with surprising stealth for a man his age. Sarah waited until Vance and Harlow had passed her position, then began tracking them through the forest, moving parallel to their course. The damp earth muffled her footsteps, while the occasional rumble of distant thunder masked any small sounds she couldn't avoid. As she followed, Sarah methodically prepared the forest itself to serve her purposes. A carefully positioned branch. Across the trail, a subtle redirection of a rainwater stream to soften the ground ahead. Small adjustments that would seem like natural features to her quarry, but would slow and separate them at critical moments. The hunt had begun in earnest, but not the one Vance had planned. Cruz rode cautiously toward the Blackwood Ranch, his young face troubled in the moonlight. This job had gone far beyond what he'd signed on for. Intimidating settlers was one thing. He'd done plenty of that working for land speculators before. But the look in Vance's eyes when he'd discussed using the boy as leverage, that was something else entirely. A twig snapped somewhere to his left. Cruz reined in his horse, hand dropping to his revolver as he peered into the darkness. "Who's there? Show yourself!" "Careful where you point that gun, son." Marshal Everett emerged from the shadows, his badge catching the moonlight. Threatening. A federal officer is a hanging offense in this territory. Cruz's hand hesitated over his holster. "I don't want any trouble, Marshal." "Funny way of showing it," Everett observed dryly. "Riding armed onto private property after assaulting the owners earlier today." "That wasn't my idea," Cruz protested. "Vance is taking this too far. He's planning to use the boy to force Mrs. Blackwood to sign over the land. And you're just following orders?" Everett's voice hardened. "That excuse doesn't carry much weight with judges. Believe me." Cruz's shoulders slumped slightly. "What choice do I have? Vance knows about my past. He'll have me in territorial prison by sundown if I cross him." "There's always a choice," Everett countered, stepping closer. "Help us stop Vance now, and I'll put in a word with the judge about your cooperation. Might make the difference between a short sentence and a long one." Cruz considered this, weighing his limited options. Before he could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the forest, a rifle shot, followed moments later by a second. "The signal," Cruz breathed, eyes widening. "Two shots. They found the boy." Everett's expression darkened. Where would they have gone?" "The North Ridge," Cruz replied, turning his horse. "There's an old line cabin up there." Vance thought, the boy might be using it as a shelter after the storm. "Let's ride," Everett ordered, mounting his own horse. "And Cruz, choose your side carefully. There's no middle ground left." The young gunman nodded once, determination replacing uncertainty on his face as they spurred their horses toward the distant gunshots. On the rocky slope of the North Ridge, Ethan pressed himself flat against the ground as a bullet whined overhead, smashing into a pine tree behind him. He'd nearly walked straight into Vance and Harlow as they ascended the trail, only his woodcraft saving him from immediate discovery. Now he was pinned down behind inadequate cover as Vance methodically worked the lever of his expensive Remington rifle, sending another round singing through the night air. "That was just to get your attention, boy," Vance called out, his cultured voice incongruous in the wilderness setting. "Come out now, and no one needs to get hurt." Ethan remained silent, mind racing as he assessed his options. The rocky slope offered little cover, and the only path of retreat would expose him to clear lines of fire. "Your mother will be joining us soon," Vance continued, his voice carrying easily in the night air. "Wouldn't want her to walk into anything unfortunate, would we?" Anger flared in Ethan's chest, but he controlled it, remembering his father's lessons. Anger clouds judgment, patience creates opportunity. A subtle movement in the trees behind Vance caught Ethan's attention, a shadow detaching itself from deeper shadows. His mother had found them, her approach undetected as she circled to a position of advantage. "Last chance, boy," Vance called, raising his rifle again. 3 seconds before I start shooting in earnest." "I wouldn't do that if I were you," came a new voice from the darkness to Vance's right, Silas Kane, emerging from the trees with his revolver drawn. "Put the rifle down, Vance. This has gone far enough." Vance's head snapped toward his former employee, momentary shock replaced by fury. "You dare turn on me, after what I've paid you?" "Some things can't be bought," Kane replied evenly. "Even in my line of work." "Apparently loyalty is one of them," Vance sneered, subtly adjusting his aim toward Kane instead. "I should have known. Better than to trust a man with your reputation." "My reputation?" Kane raised an eyebrow. "My reputation is for finishing jobs I start and honoring agreements I make. But there are lines I don't cross, Vance. Using a boy as leverage against his mother, that's one of them." As they faced off, Maddox materialized from the darkness behind Harlow, pressing his hideaway pistol against the big man's back. "Drop the gun, Jeremiah. Nice and easy." Harlow hesitated only briefly before complying, his weapon thudding into the damp earth. "This is absurd," Vance sputtered, looking from Kane to Maddox with disbelieving rage. "You're throwing away everything for—" "What, some misguided frontier code?" "Not a code." Sarah Blackwood's voice cut through the night as she stepped into view, her rifle trained unwaveringly on Vance's chest. "A reckoning." Vance's face paled in the moonlight as he found himself surrounded. Sarah on one side, Kane on another, Maddox controlling Harlow, and now Ethan rising from his position on the slope, his father's Colt drawn and steady. "You're making a terrible mistake," Vance warned, desperation edging into his voice. "I have connections throughout the territory. The governor himself dines at my table." "Not anymore, he doesn't," announced Marshal Everett, riding into the clearing, with Cruz beside him. "Governor Hayes arrived on the evening train. I just received a telegram from the territorial capital. Seems there's been an investigation into certain irregular land deals in Copper Creek. Your name features prominently." "Vance." "Impossible," Vance whispered, his composure cracking completely. "The governor wasn't due until tomorrow." "Plans change," Everett replied with grim satisfaction, "especially when federal marshals inform territorial authorities about potential corruption and attempted murder." All color drained from Vance's face. "I've done nothing of the sort. This is all a misunderstanding." "Save it for the judge," Everett interrupted, dismounting smoothly. "Jackson Vance, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, assault, and about a dozen other charges we'll sort out back in town." As the marshal moved forward to disarm him, Vance made his final, desperate play. With surprising speed, he swung his rifle toward Sarah, finger tightening on the trigger. The crack of a single shot echoed across the ridge, but it hadn't come from Vance's weapon. The land speculator stood frozen for a moment, a look of genuine surprise on his face as he stared down at the spreading crimson stain on his expensive waistcoat. He crumpled slowly to his knees, the unfired rifle slipping from nerveless fingers. Kane lowered his smoking revolver, his weathered face impassive. "Some men don't know when they're beaten." Everett knelt beside the fallen man, checking for a pulse, but finding none. He looked up at Kane with a professional's understanding. Clear case of self-defense. He was about to fire on Mrs. Blackwood. "That's how I saw it," Cruz confirmed quietly. "Same here," Maddox added. Sarah moved to stand beside her son, placing a hand on his shoulder as they watched the final chapter of Vance's schemes play out before them. "It's over, Ethan. Our land is safe." As dawn broke over Shadowpine Forest, casting long golden rays through the ancient pines, the unlikely group made their way down the ridge toward the Blackwood Ranch. The hunters had become the hunted, and, in the end, the land itself had determined the outcome, just as it had for 3 generations of the Blackwood family. The wilderness they called home had protected its own. 2 weeks after the confrontation on the North Ridge, the Blackwood Ranch basked in the golden light of late afternoon. The damaged fences had been repaired, scattered cattle rounded up, and a sense of normalcy had begun to return to the property. On the wide front porch, Sarah Blackwood sat in her rocking chair, hands busy repairing a bridle while she watched. Her son split firewood in the yard. Each swing of Ethan's axe carried a new confidence, a settled purpose that hadn't been there before. The events in Shadowpine Forest had transformed him, burning away the last vestiges of boyhood and revealing the man Thomas had always believed he would become. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Marshal Everett rode into the yard, accompanied by an elderly Native American man whose dignified bearing marked him as someone of importance. "Afternoon, Sarah, Ethan," Everett called, dismounting with a grace that belied his years. "Brought someone who wanted to pay. His respects. This is Chief Greyhawk of the Blackfoot. He knew your husband back in the scouting days." Sarah set aside her work, standing to greet the visitor with genuine warmth. "Chief Greyhawk, Thomas spoke of you often with great respect." The old chief inclined his head. Thomas Blackwood was a man who listened more than he spoke, a rare quality among your people. His dark eyes settled on Ethan with keen assessment. "This is the son. He has his father's stance." Ethan stepped forward, offering his hand in the white man's custom, while giving a respectful nod in the native tradition. Greyhawk's weathered face creased in approval at the gesture. "Come inside," Sarah invited. "Coffee's hot, and there's venison stew on the stove." As they settled around the kitchen table, Everett produced a sealed envelope from his coat. "Official business first. This just arrived from the territorial capital." He slid the document across to Sarah. "Governor Hayes has formally recognized your rightful claim to all 3,000 acres, including the North Ridge. No more challenges or disputes." Sarah opened the envelope, scanning its contents with a small smile. "And what of Mayor Walsh?" "Resigned in disgrace," Everett reported with satisfaction, "facing charges for his role in Vance's schemes. The new town council seems considerably more honest, though time will tell." "And the railroad?" Ethan asked. "Rerouting through Silverton Pass after all," Everett replied. "More expensive, but with Vance's gold no longer part of the equation, they decided it was the wiser route anyway. Copper Creek will still get its station eventually, just not the main junction Vance promised." Chief Greyhawk studied the fire crackling in the hearth before speaking. "The land knows its true guardians. It has spoken through you." He turned to Sarah. "Thomas told me once why he chose this place above all others. He said the mountains here reminded him of you, strong, enduring, with unexpected warmth for those who took time to know them truly." A faint blush colored Sarah's cheeks at the unexpected revelation. "He never told me that. Men often speak truth to friends they cannot find words for, with those they love most deeply," the chief observed with gentle wisdom. As evening approached, they moved to the porch to watch the sunset paint the distant peaks with fire. Everett leaned against the railing, hat in hand, his face thoughtful in the fading light. "Had an interesting visitor in town yesterday," he remarked casually. "Silas Kane." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "I wouldn't have expected him to linger in the territory after what happened." "He's headed north, apparently. Canada, maybe. But he wanted me to deliver a message first." Everett pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket, handing it to Ethan. "Said this belongs to your family by rights." Ethan opened the pouch, tipping several gold nuggets into his palm, the same ones Vance had shown his men to motivate them. "Kane said something else interesting," Everett continued. "Said crossing paths with you reminded him there are some things worth more than gold. Told me to tell you he was hanging up his guns for good." "Do you believe him?" Sarah asked quietly. Everett shrugged. "Men like Kane don't change easily. But Sometimes seeing a reflection of what might have been can redirect a life. Time will tell. As twilight deepened, Chief Greyhawk rose to leave. I must return to my people. But first, a gift. He presented Ethan with a beautifully crafted knife, its handle carved from elk antler, its blade gleaming in the last light. Your father carried one like this during our campaigns together. It is a tool, not a weapon, though it can be both when necessary, like the man who carries it. After the visitors departed, Sarah and Ethan remained on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. Pa would be proud, Ethan said finally, of how we protected what's ours. He would be proud of you, Sarah corrected gently. You became the man he hoped you'd be, perhaps sooner than either of us expected. I had a good teacher, Ethan replied, with a sidelong glance at his mother. Two of them. Sarah smiled, gazing toward the forest that had been both their battleground and salvation. In the gathering darkness, Shadowpine's ancient pines stood as silent sentinels, guardians of secrets old and new. What will we do about the gold? Ethan asked after a while. File a claim? Sarah considered this. Not yet. The land has kept that. A secret safe for generations. Let it rest a while longer. There's time enough for such decisions. The cool night air carried the scent of pine and sage as mother and son contemplated their future. A future secured by their own courage and the legacy Thomas had left them. Not just the land itself, but the knowledge and skills to defend it, and the wisdom to know what was truly worth fighting for. In Shadowpine Forest, the night creatures began their chorus, reclaiming the wilderness that had briefly become a battlefield. But for the Blackwoods, it had always been something more. A home, a haven, a heritage passed from one generation to the next. And now, as the full moon rose over the Crimson Mountains, casting silver light across the land that bore their name, it had become something else as well, a testament to their strength, a monument to their resilience, and a promise for all the days to come. The Blackwood legacy was secure, and in the heart of their forest, peace had returned at last. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.